Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer think tank in Delray Beach. This podcast, we are again doing Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman's book, The Washington in Action and Third World Fascism, The Political Economy of Human Rights, Volume 1. And again, we will be talking about the racist murderers, the mafia murderers of the U.S. government, the white, murderers that are mafia types that did campaigns across Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines. That is the subject of today's conversation. They are racist American, murderous mafia gangsters, that did a vicious campaign of terror across the Philippines. So, the Google Drive link will be in the description section. And you can just, look at the Google Drive link when you're, able to. You can download the book. This book, the Noam Chomsky, Edward Herman, is going to be in the Google Drive link. So just, grab it from the description section of the YouTube video. So some background. It is clear that President Koesne Sukarno was ousted in the United States angry white vigilante mafia butchers of Washington during the 1965 September 30th movement, in which a kidnapping of several army generals led by Colonel Untung was initiated by conversations between the CIA, United States Congress, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Lyndon Johnson, the State Department, the American nexus of academic white frauds of the University of California Berkeley, later named the Berkeley Mafia of President Suharto, and Russel Fiefield of the University of Michigan, as well as Harvard and Yale University, Lucian Pye of MIT, and several other academic professors of universities in the United States, and various American white fraud capitalists, including Guy Pauker of Rand Corporation, Ford Foundation, and the military generals of Indonesia. We have reviewed the book, 10 Years Military Terror in Indonesia. We have described the international context in which Indonesia was released from Dutch colonial rule in 1949. After being released, the popular and democratically elected leader, Koesne Sukarno, immediately rose to power. He stayed in power throughout the 1950s and until 1965. He was a revered Indonesian patriot, nationalist, against Washington colonialism and racist mafia murderous oppression, and very interested in Indonesian sovereignty and prosperity. He fought for oil nationalization, as well as nationalization of all Indonesian natural resources, including oil reserves, timber, copra cakes, coffee, tea, tobacco, palm oil, palm kernels, pepper, and hard fibers, as well as the natural gas of Indonesia, which they had in abundant supply. This nationalistic ideology conflicted with the racist mafia butchers of Washington. Washington used every opportunity to undercut Sukarno's democratic and popular support, including illegal actions, direct military confrontation with the threat of naval blockade and attack, continued secretive communications with treasonous generals of the Indonesian army, and CIA covert action with various personnel of the United States mafia government in Indonesia. It is clear that the oil reserves of Indonesia were large reasons for the U.S. government's genocidal mafia murderous campaign against the Indonesian people, as President Sukarno was interested in nationalizing the oil industry and also nationalizing the resources of the land. This, of course, is the birthright of the Indonesian people that was ripped away by the colonial, white, racist, murderous mafia gangsters of Washington. Dr. Chomsky also discusses Thailand and the Philippines, Thailand being a corrupt firm base with the white mafia American racist gangsters supplying military weapons to the dictatorship that keeps the people in a position of slavery and economic misery. The small Thai elite keep the money in their hands and become the agents of Washington's butcher campaign in Southeast Asia. This is exemplified by the Thai ruthless dictator, Thanom Kitchakorn, who subjugated his people to severe repression and murder through the white American mafia thugs. Finally, we discuss Philippines, where Ferdinand Marcos, the ruler of the Philippines, was a military dictator that created hell on earth for his people, using Washington guns and genocidal hardware in enslaving the Filipino masses while his elites enjoyed luxury lifestyle and freedom to choose who to machine gun down in the Philippine Republic. So in summary, the U.S. is a group of mafia white gangsters of mass murder, slavery, racist third world exploitation, and torture. So we're gonna get started. Let's just get started reading the book. I'm gonna, do the book review. We're gonna read the book, and then we will, at the end, we'll make some closing remarks. So I'm glad you could join us. Okay. The U.S. global effort to maintain and enlarge the areas with a favorable investment climate has necessitated the regular resort to terror, directly as the case in Indochina, and more often indirectly through subsidy and support for repressive clients. Bloodbaths and terror that contribute substantially to a favorable investment climate are constructive in the sense that they advance the end that clearly ranks highest in the priorities of free world leaders. In such instances, therefore, human rights issues are set aside by right-thinking people in the light of the contribution that such terror makes to quote-unquote freedom and quote-unquote security. Indonesia, mass extermination, and American mafia investors' paradise. The huge massacres in Indonesia from 1965 to 1969 have a threefold importance. In the first place, they constitute a new phase in counter-revolutionary violence marked by resort to mass extermination in an attempt to consolidate authoritarian power. Second, they provide the most revealing demonstration of the United States mafia establishment's response to a major bloodbath where the political results of the slaughter are regarded as quote-unquote positive. Third, since the reaction of responsible journalists and political leaders was enthusiastic and the world protest at the mass killings was minimal, the Indonesian bloodbath set the stage as a viable model for lesser but still large-scale anti-communist pogroms in later years, as in Chile. The massacre of Indonesia followed an alleged communist effort at a takeover in October 1965, in which the small group of left-wing army officers assassinated a half-dozen Indonesian generals. This coup was extremely convenient, providing the long-awaited legitimation for the real coup and bloodbath that came at its aftermath. The term mutiny, quote unquote, has been suggested as perhaps more appropriate than coup for the precipitating events of October 1965, and its link to the Communist Party is by no means established. The abortive coup or mutiny did, however, provide the military establishment with the excuse to destroy the only serious interinstitutional rival, the Indonesian Communist Party, or PKI. The PKI was large and well organized, had a mass base, and its policies and interests were antithetical to those of the generals. The PKI opposed dependence on the U.S. mafia murders, to which the Indonesian military had already closely tied by ideology and growing technological dependency, arms and supplies training. And the PKI was sharply critical of the corruption and mismanagement of the military-dominated bureaucrats' capitalism of the white frauds of the United States of the early 1960s, which was breaking new ground in looting and shakedowns even before the post-1963 consolidation of military power. In any event, the army was quickly established itself in power and proceeded to organize within a 4-month period one of the most extensive and brutal slaughters in human history under the auspices of the United States mafia gangsters. The Indonesian coup and terror sequel had certain similarities that of Brazil, which it followed by a year. The CIA had long been involved in Indonesian affairs, had precipitated in an unsuccessful regional rebellion in 1958, an abortive Brazilian coup had occurred in 1955, and along with the Pentagon, had supplied cash and political intelligence to the officer corps. Army-inspired anti-Chinese pogroms that took place in West Java in 1959 were financed by U.S. contributions to the local army commander. By the late 1950s, the CIA and Pentagon both had built an extensive network of connection with the Indonesian military. As noted, the Indonesian coup was immediately preceded by legitimizing the quote-unquote communist coup to which it already alleged a response. The Brazilian junta and the sponsoring U.S. leadership of mafia, racist, murderous thugs could only claim communist infiltration and bloodthirsty plans, which more than sufficed for the matters of U.S. public opinion. Although perhaps more would have been needed to justify the extermination of the Hispanic and indigenous peoples. As in the case of Brazil, the Indonesian military officer corps had been built and trained by the U.S. Quote, 1/3 of the Indonesian general staff had some sort of training from Americans, and almost half of the officer corps, the American and Indonesian military, had come to know each other rather well. Bonds of personal respect and even affection existed. One of those closest with the United States mafia military and most respected by them. General Nasution achieved some notoriety by openly demanding the total extermination of all 3 million Communist Party members, plus all their followers and sympathizers. One of the army leaders in the very forefront of the killing, Colonel Sarwo Eddy, had been a CIA contact man while serving in the Indonesian embassy in Australia. So just give me 1 second. I'm going to just make an adjustment. I think there's, some lighting issues. So just give me 1 second. It'll be just 1 second. Glad you could join us. Okay, that's much better. I just wanted to ensure that we had a nice view of the screen. So, in mid-November of 1965, Suharto formally authorized a cleaning out of the Indonesian Communist Party and set up a special military team to supervise this final solution. The army played a key role in this Holocaust, doing a large part of the killing directly, supplying tricks, weapons, and encouragement to paramilitary and vigilante death squads, and actively stimulating anti-communist hysteria that contributed greatly to the wholesale mass murder by the United States mafia, butchers, and gangsters. A key part in stirring up a mood of butchery was played by media fabrications, which were concocted with a sophistication suggestive of American assistance. Photos of the bodies of the dead generals badly decomposed after 3 days in a well were featured in all newspapers and TV broadcasts, and accompanying text claiming that the generals had been castrated and their eyes gouged out by communist women. The army later made the mistake of allowing official medical autopsies to be included as evidence in some of the trials, and the extremely detailed reports of the injuries suffered only mentioned bullet wounds and some bruises, no eye gouging or castration. The cynically fabricated campaign and well-designed to arouse panic about communist sadism and thus to set the stage for the second largest Holocaust of the 20th century. The mass killings began in late October 1965 in central Java, with the arrival there of the paratroopers, moved to East Java at the end of November as the paratroopers moved east, and on to Bali about mid-December, again correlated with a move of the paratroopers. Lists compiled by the military were given to the right wing Muslim groups who were armed with parangs and transported in army trucks to villages where they killed with bloody mutilation. School children were asked to identify communists, quote unquote, and many so identified were shot on the spot by army personnel, along with their whole families. Many people were denounced as communists in personal disputes, and on the basis of one word or the pointing of a finger, people were taken away to be killed. The killing was on such a huge scale as to raise a sanitation problem in East Java and North Sumatra, where the smell of decaying flesh was pervasive and rivers were impassable because of the clogging by human bodies. The slaughter was described by the anti-communist Indonesia expert Justice M. van der Kroft as a frightful anti-communist pogrom, where it is to be feared innocent victims of mere hearsay were killed, as opposed presumably to the guilty communist men, women, and children who fully deserved their fate. In 1968, there was a renewal of mass executions, and in one single case, in early 1968, 9 army and local civic guards in central Java were said to have killed some 3,500 alleged followers of the PKI by means of blows of iron staves in the neck. According to van der Kroeft, it was a period of endless and often arbitrary arrests, brutalization of prisoners, and an atmosphere of distrust in which exhibitions of violent anti-communism are believed to be the best way to convince suspicious local military of one's bona fides. So you can see, I just want to make a comment. The U.S. government, the racist mafia, murderous gangsters, the criminal gangsters of the U.S. government, they allowed for the PKI genocide. This was a group that the United States had been targeting since Eisenhower's administration in the 1950s, and they continued to follow and closely communicate with the treasonous military generals of General Suharto and the Indonesian army, and they used them to do an extermination campaign against the poor people of Indonesia. The only problem with the PKI was their interest in a birthright privilege of their oil. They wanted to nationalize their oil. The American government are racist, murderous, mafia gangsters. Continuing on, the number killed in the Indonesian bloodbath has always been uncertain, but an authoritative minimum was established in October 1976 when Admiral Sudomo, the head of the Indonesian state security system, in an interview over a Dutch television station, estimated that more than 500,000 people had been slaughtered. He explained to Henry Kam of the New York Times that these deaths had been the result of an unhealthy competition between the parties who were causing chaos. Other authorities have been given estimates running from 700,000 to many more than 1 million. The period of the massacres, the official figures of people arrested, exclusive of the 500,000 or more communists, quote unquote, killed, is 750,000. AI estimates in 1977 that there were still between 55,000 and 100,000 political prisoners. Of the 750,000 arrested, only about 500 have been brought to trial, usually by military tribunals, and usually receiving death sentences. Uncounted thousands died in prison by malnutrition and untreated illness. Amnesty International has not found a single case of a prisoner not being found guilty. Thus, tens of thousands of prisoners today are held captive without trials, or used as servants by local military commanders, or exploited as forced labor, or subjected to an archaic policy of transportation to penal colonies. They are ill-treated by the authorities. The majority have now been held prisoner for more than 11 years without trial. Men, women, and children are held prisoner arbitrarily and at the direction of local military commanders. The condition of the Indonesian prisons have been and remained appalling, and torture has been employed systematically in interrogation. According to AI, young girls below the age of 13, old men, people who were not frail and ill, were not exempt from torture. It was used not only for interrogation, but also as punishment and with sadistic intent. Cases of sexual assault on women and extreme cruelty were reported to Amnesty International. Deaths from torture were frequently reported up till the end of the 1960s. At the present time, Amnesty International receives reports of cases of torture under interrogation. The worst cases are those of military officers and men suspected of left-wing tendencies who are tortured by their fellow officers. The Air Force Interrogation Center in Jakarta is particularly notorious for its use of brutal and prolonged torture. Meanwhile, the land of mass murder and huge concentration camps quickly became a paradise for investors, quote unquote. The generals have followed the typical sub-fascist strategy of alliance with powerful foreign interests for the joint exploitation of the local markets, resources, and people. The blind growth development model was adopted, emphasizing rapid increases in investment technology through foreign investment and expertise. The Foreign Investment Law of February 1967 provided the requisite tax and other incentives, and a major influx of foreign capital ensued, with the United States leading the way in mining and the Japanese especially important in textiles. By 1973, foreign ministers controlled 59% of the capital in forestry, 96% in mining, 35% in industry, 47% in hotels and tourism, and 33% in agriculture and fisheries. The lifting of restriction on imports and the encouragement of foreign investment also led to a substantial denationalization in sectors traditionally dominated by local enterprise: batik, textiles, beverages, foodstuffs, and cigarettes. A process hastened by the lack of capital access of local entrepreneurs in a system of privileged credit and restrictive credit policies. Now, new agricultural technologies, the monopolization of rural credit by individual, large, and corporate farmers, and the rise of agricultural land also resulted in massive disposition of peasants and a greater redundancy of agricultural laborers, a fall in agricultural wage rates, widespread hunger, and widening gap between village rich and poor. Anderson notes that in the wake of the destruction of the PKI, the modest land reform and crop sharing legislation of the Sukarno years had become a dead letter. Much of the land redistributed in the early 1960s had reverted to its earlier owners by the early 1970s. Although the law provided for 50-50 shares in the crop between tenant and landlord, in many areas the actual ratio ran as high as 70-30 or even 80-20 in the landlord's favor. It was only too easy to brand any attempts to enforce the land reform and sharecropping statutes as quote-unquote communist, with the memory of the massacres of 1965 to 1966, which took place largely in the villages, still only too vivid. Few poor farmers dared to try to organize to defend their legal rights. Foreign capital had to pay a steep price for the privilege of entry and in protection money, quote unquote, demanded by the generals. The pervasiveness and scale of the looting in the post-1965 New Order have been unique even for the world of fascism. In 1977, Business Week reported that the foreign business community was dismayed by the blatant growth of corruption, citing the case of the general manager of Inco's nickel project, brought to court on libel charge for dismissing an Indonesian company manager and having the state judge offer to dismiss the case for $10,000. Even Jakarta-based businessmen who are accustomed to wholesale bribery are disturbed that the World Bank's threat to hold back loans funds to squelch the payoff demand. While more widely publicized was General Telephone and Electronics' claim in 1977 that it had lost a telecommunications contact to Hughes Aircraft for refusing to pay a $40 million bribe. Hughes allegedly having paid bribes of 20% or more to Indonesian officials. Even more publicity was given to SEC complaint in 1977 against Pertamina, the state oil company of Indonesia, alleging a shakedown of 54 United States, European, and Japanese white fraud companies with Indonesian interests for money to finance the Rayamana Indonesian restaurant in New York City. An internal Exxon memo of February 1970 says, "I doubt that we can avoid this shakedown. Do you have suggestions as to the amount? Question mark. Licensing to do business, to import, to export, to exploit timber or mineral resources, government contracts, and state bank credits are all up for sale by the military elite, or else they are reserved for groups centered in a military officer or faction. The military clique dominates by controlling access to markets and credit, serving in a manner closely analogous to ordinary gangsters like the United States mafia government, who control a line of business by force and demand payoffs for entry and quote-unquote protection. In the Indonesian case, the gangsters run an entire country and insist on payment either via commissions, quote-unquote, or in joint ventures where the generals or the agents get 10 to 20%, 5% of the profits for a nominal investment. Besides selling licenses and other privileges, the general and their families or clients may form their own sole agency companies, frequently using Chinese managers. Thus, the Suharto Associated Company owns the Volkswagen agency, General Sutomo owns the Mitsubishi agency, and so on down the line. The Suharto interests begin with the Kendana Group, containing 15 companies in banking, real estate, cement, flour milling, rubber logging, trading, and other activities. Suharto, his wife, brother, 2 brothers-in-law, and other relatives and clients have shareholdings in a variety of foreign companies which regularly receive monopoly rights and subsidize bank credits. The business empires of the generals are nets of minority shareholdings in joint ventures in which their role is strictly political. So you can see the U.S. government, they used General Suharto to mass murder in Indonesia, and they gave him huge amounts of subsidies, money, cash, direct, open, bribery by the U.S. government. This is a mafia state, a mafia group of criminal, racist, white gangsters. Continuing on, the diversion of tax monies and foreign aid into privileged pockets has also attained spectacular levels under the new order. A scandal in 1968 involved the misuse and looting of about 30% of several $100 million of aid made available by foreign governments in that year. Ingrid Palmer, in fact, estimates a 30% corruption drain in Indonesian aid programs in general. An interesting feature of the constantly recurring scandals and their sequel of promised cleanup is that while the major looters are at the top is immune from prosecution. Explaining why all those brought to court were small fish, Suharto, Attorney General in charge of the anti-corruption tribe, said for the time being the cases of the big fish cannot be finalized because of technical difficulties. During 1968, 172 cases were investigated, but none involved members of the armed forces. Indonesian corruption is so vast that a new language has been required to cope with the sticky handshake, quote unquote, in its many variants. The faint crackle of money changing hands is as pervasive here as the scent of clove in cigarette smoke. The looser goes by many names. Smooth money, quote unquote. Lubricating rupiahs, quote unquote, about $5. Lately, the government has been referring to extortion by low-level civil servants as illegal levies. Illegal levies are everywhere, and almost everybody is involved, declares Admiral Sudomo, head of a body known as the National Command for the Restoration of Security and Order. In 1977, the generals began another campaign to totally exterminate corruption at every level over a 10-year period. A proclamation to this effect was greeted with great hilarity. There may have been many like it, and they have all turned out to be so much hot air. This time, however, the government may have reasons for being serious. The level of public rapacity has grown here in recent years. The higher-ups are taking much more, it is said, and they aren't spreading it around. Perhaps more important than a shakedown form of corruption just described have been the processes of strictly internal looting of Indonesia by its military elite. In 1957, when the large Dutch holdings were taken over by the Indonesian state, the successor companies, although minimally nationalized, were given over to control and management of the generals. These important enterprises were mismanaged and plundered on grand scale, part of the looting being for the private profit of individual officers, some of it to a conversion of resources to use by the army. Only Pertamina, the state oil company, escaped serious decline or ruin for a time. Following the introduction of the new order in 1965, these national enterprises went into relative decline, but they remained absolutely important in several areas such as oil, mining, and trading. Internal corruption assumed the form of plain stealing on a new and large scale, and the discriminatory manipulation of bank credits, and the privileged exploitation of state monopolies. As noted by Anderson, most banks operated under military supervision and were compelled to offer huge credits and unrealistically low interest rates to senior officers or sukong working with them. Very often, these cheap credits were not used for productive investment, but for real estate speculation, land grabbing, luxury housing, and so forth. Second was the survival of a number of important state monopolies, which in effect legally excluded indigenous entrepreneurs from certain economic fields. Particularly notorious instances of these were and are the state oil company Pertamina and Bulag, the National Supply Board, which controls the import, marketing, and domestic purchase of basic staples. Not surprisingly, these lucrative monopolies were and are the fiefdoms of important military supporters of Suharto. The reign of denationalized and thieving generals has led to a great emphasis on infrastructure investments convenient to the export sector and exotic projects, frequently capital intensive and very expensive. The satellite domestic communications network program, in connection with the GTE Hughes dispute, arose in one of those in the exotics, quote unquote, to which the state has already allocated $840 million in 1978 without noticeable effect on communications even in Jakarta. And the Times notes that many bankers and economists question whether the government and this impoverished nation, where nearly half the people earn less than $50 a year, can really afford such projects. But the generals, like good roads and modern communications, which demonstrate their modernity, serve the convenience of the small upper classes who may wish to see Muhammad Ali on television, and facilitate the monitoring and military control of the population. Given the sensitive needs of the masses, the choices are understandable. The Indonesian generals, even more than military in Brazil, the Dominican Republic, South Vietnam, and Thailand, have used power to catapult themselves to the top level of elite economic status. They live in lavish, quote unquote, American style haciendas, renting for $1,800 and more a month, while hundreds sleep under the country. In this country, with a per capita income of $68 per year. Some of them have become fabulously wealthy. The Jakarta Press reports Ibnu Sutomo's personal gifts of mosques and athletic officials, quote unquote, and their families are owners of a large proportion of luxury Jakarta housing leased to foreign executives and are moving right into the rice land ownership on a considerable scale, significantly changing the power structure in rural Indonesia. With the institutionalized looting of huge proportions, plus a set of policies whereby the generals guarantee the interests of their corporate, mainly foreign partners, quote unquote, it is little wonder that the immense surge of oil revenues contributed little or nothing to rational economic development or succor for the underlying Indonesian population. In fact, the state oil company, Pertamina, succeeded in running itself into bankruptcy by excessive borrowing, wild misinvestment, and what one Indonesian source refers to as, quote, undoubtedly the worst plundering of the 20th century, maybe in the world. its excesses left Indonesia with an added debt burden of over $6 billion and a sharply reduced international credit standing, which will be paid for by the general populace. According to the Wall Street Journal, Pertamina investments cater to foreign oil companies by building roads, bridges, houses, and schools, and the side it was channeling money, primarily the army, for pet projects of the various generals. So you can see, I'm just going to make a comment. So the U.S. government, they basically, stuck these generals in power, these military generals, so that they could, get at the oil, which were the birthright privileges of the Indonesian people. The United States government are racist, mafia gangsters, vicious gangsters. And, they gave all the money to all of the generals. They bankrupted Pertamina. They got them involved in huge loans and debts with IMF and all sorts of World Bank groups. And they basically destroyed the Indonesian the economy and starved the Indonesian people. These are the racist American, murderous white mafia gangsters. According to the same source, government investigation have shied away from the most sensitive area of all, the whisper of a connection between Pertamina's dubious advantage and the family of President Suharto. There are countless rumors that are heard in Jakarta that Lieutenant General Ibnu Sutowo, Pertamina's deposed president, poured Pertamina money into the private business operation of President Suharto's wife and brother. All things considered, then, the development of the past dozen years in Indonesia has been favorable to the predominant interests and priorities of the free world in general, the United States in particular with Japan. Appropriately, therefore, Vice President Mondale stops in Indonesia for a friendly conference with that fellow devotee of freedom and human rights, General Suharto, and is much encouraged by an announced release of political prisoners. It almost goes without saying that the State Department will whitewash the continuing massive violation of murder and human rights abuse within Indonesia and will continue its annual apologetics for the ongoing Indonesian aggression in East Timor. In each instance, the State Department relies on statements by the Indonesian government, which it accepts on or pretends to accept at face value without any verification. Once again, since our businessmen and military intelligence establishment are reasonably happy, massive violations of murder, genocide, and human rights are entirely irrelevant to the mafia murders of the United States government. It is only entirely understandable that the U.S. response to the 1965-1966 Holocaust proper was restrained. No congressman denounced it on the floor of Congress, and no major U.S. relief organization offered aid. The World Bank, unaffected by either terror or the systematic looting of bank money, subsequently made Indonesia its third largest borrower, with about $2 billion in loans over the past decade. Media treatment of the massacres was sparse, with the victims usually described merely as, quote, communists and sympathizers. Little attention was made to the large numbers of women and children massacred or the modes and details of the slaughter. A characteristic rationalization was that people rose up in anger against the communists in a political upheaval that had an air of irrationality about it, a touch of madness even, tinged not only with fanaticism, but with bloodlust and something like witchcraft. Nowhere but on these weird and lovely islands would such an affair have, quote unquote, erupted. The rationalization is useful in suggesting falsely that this was a purely spontaneous popular upheaval, a peculiarly Asian form of, quote unquote, madness, not a mass murder coordinated and stimulated from the top with direct participation by the military forces of the state, which acted with Nazi-like ruthlessness, demonstrating qualities that the United States government mafia butchers had feared they might lack. The U.S. liberals who sometimes offered such rationalization would find them less appealing as an account of Tsarist or Nazi pogroms against the Jews, which had a similar blend of popular hostility and top-level encouragement, planning, and organization. We have cited media statements about the positive, quote unquote, and hopeful, quote unquote, nature of the changes in Indonesia. No details given. With a little time elapsed, George MacArthur, well-known Far East correspondent of the Los Angeles Times, has now produced a complete role reversal between assailants and victims. In discussing relations between Indonesia and China, he states, the Indonesians broke relations in 1965 when the Mao-inspired Communist Party, now outlawed, attempted to seize power and subjected the country to a bloodbath. This bland statement that it was the victims of the massacre who, quote, subjected the country to a bloodbath is no slip of the pen, but rather a characteristic systemic formulation. Elsewhere, the same noted correspondent refers to the attempted communist coup in 1965 as follows. Quote, the attempt failed in a national bloodbath that ended the career of President Sukarno, who had tried to ride the communist tiger. These examples exemplify the outer limits of subservience to the United States government propaganda system. The more typical pattern is to downplay the bloodbath and repression, which continues to this day. For the leaders of the United States, this bloodbath was a definite plus. In the Freedom House advertisement in the New York Times, November 30th, 1966, signed by 145 distinguished Americans, including Jacob Javits, Dean Acheson, Thomas Cabot, Harry Giddens, Lewis Powell, Whitelaw Reid, Lincoln Bloomfield, and Samuel Huntington, the Department of Government at Harvard, the events in Indonesia were treated as follows. If the Vietnam intervention by the United States provided a shield for the sharp reversal of Indonesia's shift toward communism, which has removed the threats into Singapore and Malaysia, and as we have already noted in the statements on Asian policy sponsored by Freedom House and signed initially by 14 leading, quote, moderate political scientists and historians, later by many others, the series of events that included the huge Indonesian bloodbath were described merely as dramatic changes, quote unquote, implicitly constructive in character, although these scholars, as noted earlier, condemn, quote unquote, violence as a mode of achieving social change. This humanistic treatment was paralleled by that of the late Prime Minister of Australia, Howard Holt, who told the River Club of New York City in July 1966 that with 500,000 to 1 million communist sympathizers knocked off in Indonesia, I think it is safe to assume that reorientation has taken place. Late in 1972, General Maxwell Taylor explained the U.S. News and World Report that Indonesia's independence today and its relative freedom from an internal communist threat are attributable to a large degree to what we have accomplished in South Vietnam. With the large U.S. forces moving into Vietnam, the Indonesian anti-communists were willing to run the risk of eliminating President Sukarno and destroying the Indonesian communists. That's all. It apparently does not even occur to this military advisor, quote unquote, to 4 presidents that any moral issue might arise in destroying the Indonesian communist people. This was a constructive bloodbath. The victims, once identified as communist, quote unquote, have lost all claim to humanity and merit whatever treatment they received. What is more, the victims may have been largely ethnic Chinese and landless peasants, and the counter-coup, in effect, reestablished traditional authority more firmly. Since the result was the preservation of a neo-colonial economic and social United States colonial structure and an open door, quote unquote, to United States investment, only sentimentalists will moralize over the murderous bloodbath. The academic, business, political, and intellectual leaders of the United States must turn their attention to more serious matters. Thailand, a corrupt firm base. An important illustration of U.S. sponsorship and support for sub-fascist terror regimes of better than average viciousness and venality, and an equally consistent lack of sympathy with the democratic political tendencies is provided by recent Thai history. Thailand emerged from World War II as the only state in Southeast Asia whose military leadership had collaborated with the Japanese to the extent of declaring war on the United States and Great Britain. Immediately after the war, U.S. officials refused to go along with the British desire to dismantle the apparatus of military power in Thailand. Thereafter, the United States gradually increased its support for the military faction. As a result, after a few years of constitutional rule characterized by quote-unquote temporizing support of the democratic forces by the United States, the military was able to reestablish full control, and Phibun Songkhram became the first pro-Axis dictator to regain power after the war. Phibun quickly mastered the art of extracting both moral and material support from the United States cold warriors, milking to use Joe Stilwell's earthy reference to Chiang Kai-shek, constantly creating alarms of external and internal red threats, and encouraging local newspapers to denounce the United States so that his government could appeal for more U.S. aid on grounds that it would help pacify this anti-American segment of public opinion. And of course, serving as a loyal agent of his North American supportees in Seattle and elsewhere. In the apt language of the NFLF's description of the Diem regime and its successors, this was a country selling government, quote unquote. In the Orwellian perceptions of Washington officialdom, however, this all reflected the free choice of the Thai people. Thailand decided to adopt collectivist security as the basis for its foreign policy, quote unquote. Phibun used the diplomatic support, money, and arms provided by the United States mafia leadership as his primary source of political power in Thailand, frequently timing his violence against his opponents to coincide with an important meeting of the Seattle Alliance, thereby minimizing local and foreign criticism. As the Thai police state consolidated itself and became both more bloody and more corrupt, United States support was in no way diminished, and criticism by United States mafia leaders, public and private, was minimal. In fact, a notable trend throughout the period was the growing intimacy between the Thai military leaders and the top-level military officials from the United States. Legion of Merit awards were given to 3 Thai generals in 1954, and in 1955, Phibun himself was given a doctorate of laws at Columbia University and the Legion of Merit award by Eisenhower for his services in the cause of freedom. Vice President Nixon referred to Thailand's quote-unquote dedication to freedom, while New York Governor Dewey was most impressed with the settled, orderly situation, a steady improvement towards stability. When attention is called to the fact that Thailand under U.S. auspices has been a military dictatorship, the official response has been to point to, quote, encouraging political trends. If none could be dredged up at a particular moment, Asian nature and customs have been cited, along with the need to preserve Thailand's independence. At the time of Ambassador Leonard Unger's appearance before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1969, a constitutional facade was in fleeting existence, and he was greatly encouraged by this development, which rounds out a system in which the people of the country feel that they do have representation in Bangkok. But if their democracy is not quite like ours, the Thai people have their own conviction about the better system of government, about how representation should be carried out. And I personally believe it would be a mistake for us to try to lecture them on the operation of democracy. Our lectures, in fact, have been accolades to the military dictators, and to fend off criticism at home, philosophical observations on Asian nature have been coupled with a plea that it would be arrogant of us to intrude into the internal affairs of quote-unquote independent states. In fact, however, U.S. impact and influence were continuous and decisive in helping the military faction to extinguish the constitutional regime of 1946 to 1947 and to consolidate military rule thereafter. The large inflow of U.S. aid and arms, which total in excess of $2 billion between 1949 and 1969, in the official Unger view, helped Thailand to improve its internal security forces that it will be able to better meet the guerrillas and terrorist threats which have been mounted by the communists. In reality, throughout this period, until the U.S. invasion of Vietnam in 1965, the communist quote-unquote threat in Thailand was slight, and the obvious and predictable use and effect of this aid was to establish a police state and suppress the substantial non-communist opposition. Another facet of the official mythology and propaganda regarding arms aid is that it, quote, contributed Thailand's economic growth by enabling Thailand to devote a greater share of its resources to economic development. Awkwardly, however, between 1954, the year of the Suharto Treaty, and 1959, the value of Thai military expenditures rose by 250%. This was explained by Unger as a result of the growth stimulated by military aid, which provided an expanding income, some of which could be devoted to security expenditures. But Thai income per capita in 1959 was well below the levels of 1950 to 1952. Controlled by an internally unconstrained military junta, dependent on the largesse of external sponsor engaged in an anti-communist crusade, is the key to this huge expansion of military outlays in a country with pressing development needs. Rising security expenditures were part of the total package of aid armaments repression that was immensely advantageous to the Thai military elite and at the same time met the requirements of the selectively benevolent tutelage of the U.S. cold, racist white warriors. In this package, the military leaders of this, quote, land of the free, Dulles, not only were able to rely on U.S. support to establish and control a police racist state, but also were able to convert their political power into bribery, graft, and monopoly income, including significant contributions by the U.S. taxpayer. From 1948 onward, they took over the dictatorship of banks, private companies, and government corporations, and they diverted large amounts of public funds to themselves. Each military leader developed a huge private income to finance his own political organization. Police Chief Thao, the U.S. Legion of Merit of 1954, derived most of his funds from the opium trade, while Army Chief Sarrett, U.S. Legion of Merit 1954, got the proceeds of the National Lottery. At his death in 1963, Sarrett left a fortune of approximately $140 million, a matter disclosed only when relatives began squabbling over the booty. As in Indonesia, much income of the military elite has been derived from dozens of state enterprises run by and for military officers. Also reminiscent of Indonesia is the sizable income flow produced by a generalized shakedown, i.e., it was virtually impossible to run a major business or build a small one into a large one without enlisting the support of military men, which meant money and dictatorships. The Bangkok Bank, during its period of boom growth, had on its board 4 senior Army generals and an Army field marshal, and board members received substantial fees. A banker with close ties to the military said that the late General Chris Savara, while only a handful of boards, was paid handsomely by over 200 companies as he was their protector. A substantial fraction of U.S. aid has almost certainly gone into the pockets of members of the military junta, a fact sometimes revealed in the extensive travel and luxuries they enjoyed after fleeing the country. Former CIA analyst Darling suggested that the military leadership of Thailand was able to siphon off for the personal use a staggering 12% of the national income. The acceptability of this huge plundering to the United States leadership can be interpreted as a recognition of, quote, the Asian nature people, in this case, who could best serve the aims of the Japanese co-prosperity fascist sphere during World War II, and the necessary costs to the U.S. taxpayer of purchasing the services of these quote-unquote patriots. Bloodshed by the Thai military junta is consolidating this police state has been substantial, but it has not noticeably disturbed their American mafia sponsors. Truman's ambassador Stanton was particularly energetic in urging even more vigorous repression and frequently encouraging Thibault to be alert to the allegedly increasing signs of communist subversion among intellectuals, students, priests, and writers. After the 1975 coup, according to Darling, it was also discovered that the police chief Thao, opium trader and recipient of the U.S. Legion of Merit, had been much more ruthless in suppressing his political opponents than formerly assumed. Some of his atrocities rivaled those of the Nazis and the communists. The graves of Nai Tiang and Sirikand and four unidentified persons were uncovered in Kanburi province, and further investigation revealed that these victims have been strangled to death while being interrogated by the police. Tang had been a courageous leader in the Free Thai movement during World War II and later served in the National Assembly. Thao claimed that the former Thai leader had escaped from Thailand and joined the communists. The deaths of other victims of the police were also investigated, but the extent of the torture and murder committed by the former police chief will probably never be fully known. One of the major quote unquote assets of the police chief was the extensive assistance he received from the American owned Sea Supply Corporation, which enabled him to build the police force into a powerful military organization which was better led, better paid, and more efficient than the Army. By 1954, American assistance enabled Thao to increase the police force to 42,835 men, or one policeman for every 407 people. This was one of the highest ratios between policemen and citizens of any country in the world. The Sea Supply Corporation was a CIA front, and Thao was a CIA tool. The 1957 coup that ousted him from power was carried out by the army, which had been built up a separate military force, jostling for control by the Pentagon. U.S. penetration of Thailand was so extensive by the mid-1950s that the dominant factions, all military and extremely right-wing, were proxies for competing U.S. military and intelligence factions. U.S. domination by the mafia American murderous gangsters was so complete and the denigration of civilian rule so thorough that the U.S. construction of bases in Thailand was begun in the early 1960s without knowledge of the Thai foreign minister or any other civilian leaders of that puppet state. Militarization of Thailand went steadily forward after the 1957 coup, with heavy U.S. involvement in counterinsurgency and police programs. As noted by Thaddeus Flood, not only did massive, purely military assistance intensify the militarization of Thailand during the Sarit regime, but the so-called economic aid program, which to most Americans mean buttering people's health and welfare, did the same. From fiscal year 1967 through fiscal year 1972, almost $100 million in economic aid went to civil police administration, an aspect of the counterinsurgency program, and the accelerated development program, another counterinsurgency program. All of this was before the U.S. counterinsurgency experts themselves claimed the existence of any armed insurgency in the Thailand countryside, which was in 1965. This was a form of bribery, a quid pro quo to the Thai military police elite for turning over the country to the U.S. military. Loeb notes that a number of U.S. officials saw no other explanation for the dramatic increase in aid levels when no objective emergency existed. No significant battles between the police and guerrillas occurred until mid-1965, and the training and new equipment that OPS had already so generously granted the Thai police had not been demonstrated deficient. The Vietnam War made Thailand even more thoroughly an occupied satellite of the United States, with 500,000 U.S. military personnel using Thailand as a, quote, landlocked aircraft carrier in 1968 for bombing raids against the Indo-Chinese peasant societies. Thai mercenaries were also used extensively in Laos and Vietnam. The period of war boom by the United States racist mafia occupation of Vietnam brought with it inflation, an influx of foreign capital, a huge bar and prostitution industry to Thailand. The corruption of Bangkok in this regard was notorious, and an artificial prosperity that temporarily covered over intensifying economic and social problems. The ending of the U.S. military buildup in 1968 began a period of serious political as well as socioeconomic difficulties, including a need to come to terms with the prospective U.S. withdrawal from Indochina. A short interval of democratization in 1969 to 1970 was succeeded by another military coup in November 1971, after which a further period of economic difficulties and a growing tide of unrest culminated in the October 1973 uprising. The largest demonstration in Thai history took place in Bangkok on October 13. Some 250,000 people, and a temporary retreat from power of the disorganized military police establishment followed. The period between October 1973 and October 1976, when the generals reassumed control, was an extremely delicate one, with many forces contending for power. The U.S. role during these years and the bloody outcome deserves close examination. When the military was ousted from power in 1973, there existed a situation in some ways even less propitious for the success of democracy than in Chile following the election of Allende. As in the Chilean case, there existed a very precarious balance of power between the political leadership nominally in control and the economic and military infrastructure, which had at their disposal very effective means of vetoing government actions. While in Chile there was some separation between power structures and the economy and the military, in Thailand the two were nearly identical. But if the conditions favoring democratic development were less than auspicious, the attempted changes were also less dramatic than in Chile. The government at no time attempted anything approaching a socialist program. Indeed, up until October 1974, the country was ruled under the interim constitution of 1972, which was written by the generals, and the first free election, which still excluded the communists, were not held until the end of January 1975. As might be expected, the economic situation under the new government was also anything but favorable. In a sense, the chickens of the war-based prosperity of the previous decade had come home to roost, to the disadvantage of the democratic government. The oil crisis and rise in energy prices also took their toll during the brief democratic interlude. The economic difficulties were exacerbated by a releasing of pent-up grievances of the now legalized labor movement, whose strikes also inconvenienced and upset the middle class. Democracy brought with it a surge of cultural and intellectual ferment in which personal behavior and open criticism of formerly sacrosanct cultural objects confused and disturbed many of middle-class citizens. The business-controlled mass media made the most of the strikes and cultural aberrations to stir up patriotic ardor and a longing for the simplicity of the bygone age. Thus, economic and cultural factors helped reduce the base of democratic support among the population. Significantly, during the democratic years, two ultra-right-wing movements appeared on the scene which were to prove important in the downfall of the civilian government. These were the Naafan movement of the Red Guards, both led by men closely linked to the U.S. mafia military intelligence establishment. General Wallop Rogenwisut, one of the founders of both the Naafan movement and the Red Guards, who was trained in psychological warfare in the United States and headed Thai military intelligence. The guiding force behind Red Guards, Colonel Sutsai Hatsaditan, was an officer of the CSOC, Communist Suppression Operations Command, under the Internal Security Operations Command, ISOC, the chief counterinsurgency structure of the Thai military. He worked with the CIA in organizing Mio tribesmen from Laos into a counter-revolutionary force, and he recruited into the Red Guards veterans of Thai forces that had fought in Vietnam. Both Naafan and Red Guards were terrorist organizations using assassinations, beatings, threats of force, and disruptive tactics to break strikes, disperse demonstrations, destroy or intimidate any opposition media, bombing presses, and killing or threatening publishers, journalists, and news dealers, all under the auspices of the United States mafia murderous gangsters. They were remarkably successful, with a large part of the progressive media in Thailand stifled, while right-wing papers and journalists were untouched. All of this was done, along with other acts of violence, with police connivance or protection. Thus, a new and open violence grew during this period, associated in large measure with the activities of these organized terrorist groups and profoundly affecting the political process. In contrast with the peaceful elections of January 1975, in which the left did rather well, the election of April 1976 was violent and brutal, and the legal left was virtually eliminated. More than 40 people were killed, almost all of them students and leftists, including the Secretary General of the Socialist Party, and there were numerous fire bombings and other acts of terror. During the 1976 elections, Noam contributed financially to a number of rightist candidates and backed the extreme right party, Thama Pital, which did very poorly in the election. It was widely believed in Thailand that foreign and mainly United States money flowed to some of these right-wing groups and parties. Despite the crushing electoral defeat of the ultra-right, however, its sponsors were about to resume uncontested control of the state. The military establishment had a great deal to lose from the consolidation of power of a genuinely democratic order. It had become a huge corruption machine, operating and looting government enterprises, engaged in the massive shakedown system described above, and controlling the flow of U.S. military and mafia economic aid, while siphoning a good part of it into its own pockets. U.S. and Japanese businesses did not like the prospects of democracy in Thailand either, with unions and strike once more evident, and threats of such appurtenances and sub-fascism as favorable mineral concessions and low tax rates. And the U.S. military intelligence establishment, of course, faced a loss of access. The battle lines become even clearer when it is revealed that these events occurred during a period of rapid deterioration in the U.S. position in Indochina. Thailand, having served as a strategic base for the U.S. military during the war, was still prized by the U.S. military for the Utapo naval base and the Ramesuan complex, the largest and most sophisticated U.S. electronic intelligence installation outside of the U.S. and West Germany. Because the student-led democratic movement was calling for elimination of the U.S. military presence in Thailand, it presented a direct obstacle to U.S. arms in the area, threatening to corrupt but, quote, firm base that the U.S. had enjoyed compliments of the generals. The government, during the period of civilian rule, while itself somewhat paralyzed in its efforts at reform, was also doing things which made the fight against communist guerrillas in the outlying provinces more difficult to pursue in the manner to which the army and police were accustomed. In March of 1975, the Interior Ministry revealed that the investigation of the Communist Suppression Operations Command and turned up a pattern of indiscriminate killing of subjects, and in particular the summary execution of at least 70 people during 1970 to 1971 in Pathalung province. These executions would not have been any more cause for notice than others previously, but for the fact that they seemed to mark a new style of killing in which the victims were first clubbed unconscious and then incinerated in oil drums to eliminate the evidence. In October 1976, all the various forces acting to destabilize Thai democracy came to a head. The rightist elements in an alliance with a fearful monarchy were on the offensive with wild verbal attacks and increasingly numerous physical outrages. The students were sitting at Thammasat University to protest the return to Thailand of Field Marshal Thanom Kitchakorn, a former prime minister and dictator during the period of the largest U.S. mafia military presence in Thailand. The border police, created by the CIA in 1951 and still closely linked with the CIA in fighting the guerrilla insurgents, and the Red Gores attacked the students who were virtually unarmed. Sharpshooters, automatic weapons, and even an 8-foot recoilless rifle were used in dislodging the students rather than the usual and less violent tear gas and clubs. 40 or more students were killed, and some were burned alive by the Red Gores. The fighting completely disabled the already fragmented student movement, and the military coup which took place on October 6th was quite predictable. The U.S. role in the 1976 overthrow of Thai democracy and the return to sub-fascist rule was clear and familiar in pattern. The establishment of a democratic government in late 1973 and early 1974 led to a sharp increase in military aid and a reduction in the modest economic aid, despite the troubled economic condition of Thailand. Just as in the case of Chile before the military coup, the intent was clearly hostile to the new democratic forces and supportive of the anti-democratic military police establishment. In the years after 1973, the United States sent $150 million in military aid to Thailand, while the economic aid fell from $39 million to $17 million in 1975. U.S. sales of military equipment in fiscal year 1976 totaled $90 million, more than Thailand had purchased in the previous 25 years combined. It was indicated earlier that the neo-colonial fascist terrorist organizations that played such an important role in disrupting the short-lived democratic system, the Red Guards and Nalafam, were intimately connected with U.S. mafia military intelligence operations. Both organizations emerged out of Communist Suppression Operations Command and major anti-communist counterinsurgency operations set up and funded by the United States in 1965. The leaders of both terrorist organizations were affiliated with CSOC and had close earlier links with United States mafia murderous gangsters. CIA financing and organizational support to these terrorist organizations is widely alleged. The CIA presence in Thailand had been substantial, with 100 operatives there in 1974. But as Flood notes, yet to understand the October 6th right-wing military coup and the subsequent repression, book burning, and the like, it is not necessary to posit the overt presence of CIA officers directly manipulating events in Bangkok with walkie-talkies. It is only necessary to look at the cumulative effects of almost a quarter century of careful cultivation by the U.S. of an essentially fascist-minded, repressive, reactionary, privileged military elite faced with a majority of farmers and laborers who have been deprived of the dignity of political, social, and economic recognition, given the polarization inherent in the situation and the promotion by the United States strategists of the right-wing military and police. But a move by right-wing military to displace civilian governments was inevitable, with or without CIA direct manipulation. Flood's final assessment is worth quoting at some length. In the longer perspective, the entire Thai military and police structure is the creation of the United States mafia government. More specifically, in reference to the recent bloody coup, the American-sponsored, funded, trained, and advised Internal Security Command, formerly the Communist Suppression Operations Command, had been the very embodiment of the American solution to the social problems of Asia, the counterinsurgency technique. Begun by a handful of CIA officers in 1950, pursued with thousands of Americans in a maze of the U.S. Defense Department agencies in Thailand in the 1960s and early 70s, the counterinsurgency technique has revealed itself again in Thailand, as in South Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, and the countries of Indochina until the end of the war, a technique to counter indigenous democracy, civil sovereignty, human rights, and social justice. The old altruistic illusions that the early technicians of counterinsurgency carried with them to Thailand have long since been stripped away. The ugly reality is that the intensive application of counterinsurgency techniques has produced in Thailand a political system markedly reminiscent of the civilian military fascism of the 1930s and 40s. It is to the shame of the United States mafia butchers that this system is a direct progeny of a quarter century of American intervention, especially via the Central Intelligence Agency and the Department of Defense, in the destinies of the people of Thailand. In the 1973 to 1976 period of weak democratic rule, terminated by a military coup, one searches in vain for verbal support by the United States for the new democracy, for warnings to the powerful fascistic forces to restrain themselves, or for threats of any cut-off aid or any other kinds of intervention in the event of an anti-democratic turnover. A pointless search because the, quote, land of the free despite the Orwellian impression to the contrary, was the main sponsor of Thai sub-fascism after World War II and continued that pattern from 1973 up to the present. The benefits to the U.S. leadership from support of this series of bloody and corrupt tyrannies have been simple and decisive. For U.S. money and help in preserving their power and filling their pockets, this military clique has been willing to subordinate its foreign policy to that of the United States, serve as an agent and errand boy, maintain an open door, quote unquote, to U.S. economic interests, and allow the use of Thailand as a base for U.S. counter-revolutionary intervention in Southeast Asia. Immediately following the Geneva Accords of 1954, the National Security Council laid out a plan for subversion throughout Southeast Asia, with Thailand, quote, as the focal point of U.S. covert and psychological operations, including covert operations on a large and effective scale throughout Indochina, with the explicit intentions of making more difficult the control by Viet Minh of North Vietnam. Subsequently, it became the landlocked aircraft carrier for the U.S. wars in Vietnam and Laos, as well as the source of mercenaries, as already noted. The toleration level of the U.S. leaders for graft, torture, and bloodbaths by, quote, patriotic leaders willing to defend their independence against, quote, communist aggression by serving as a, quote, firm base for their sponsors' activities is boundless. The mass media have played their usual role in support of sub-fascism by the familiar devices, minimal coverage of the details of official Thai corruption and violence, transmission of Thai U.S. official views and problems and issues as the almost exclusive form of information, and a simple refusal to probe beneath the surface of personalities and political shifts to expose the crucial U.S. role in creating, building, and shaping Thai militarism, a benevolent king, a great many generals, unruly students, an unstable political scene, some typically Asian corruption, a beautiful countryside, a traditionally friendly relationship between the United States and Thailand, whose freedom and independence the U.S. has generally been trying to protect. This is a pattern of images conveyed to the public by the U.S. fraud media whites, and it is a masterpiece of deceptive lying and propaganda. So just give me 1 second. I'm going to just take a 30-second break. I'll be back in 30 seconds, and then I will make some comments, and then we will finish. There's only 20 pages left. It's the Dominican and going to Latin America. So give me 1 second. Glad you could join us. Okay, so I'm just going to make a couple comments about the Thailand chapter. So you can see this was the typical, basically, the U.S. had enslavement of the Thai people. It was the standard situation. The U.S. used a military elite, racist mafia, murderous action by the mafia, murderous gangsters of the U.S. government, and they used the military elite to slaughter the Thai people, to keep them in a state of racist oppression and slavery, and to further their capitalist interests. It's the same thing in Southeast Asia. The U.S., proclaims to be the champion of third world peoples. They are the champion of slavery. They are the U.S. white champions of slavery. It is a group of mafia thugs, mafia bandits, and white butchers that, murder the people of Southeast Asia and, basically keep them in a state of slavery while their corporate interests, their white fraud capitalists, collect the cash, and then their media, peddle the lies and deception, and then just keep everyone going, just keep the, the lies and deception going in a propaganda campaign that everything is just fine. We have a great situation in Thailand. There is no violence. There is nothing. Meanwhile, they're being murdered, tortured, and thrown in prison by the state police, the U.S. mafia, thugs. Repacification in the Philippines. There is no better illustration of the promise that U.S. policy holds for Southeast Asia and Third World in general than the case of the Philippines, the only official U.S. colony in Asia for half a century and now still very much in the U.S. sphere of influence. One more militarized, repressive, and venal totalitarian free enterprise system, with the haves resorting once again to open violence to protect their interests against challenges from the have-nots. After a brief interlude of post-World War II quasi-independence and CIA-manipulated democracy, the democratic facade was suspended under Marcos in 1972 without significant negative response from the United States, and the standard client fascist model was put into place and given undeviating support by the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations. Filipino nationalists had declared their independence from Spain in 1898, only to be faced with an extended U.S. war of counterinsurgency, complete with massacres of civilians, burning of villages, torture, and the other appurtenances of pacification. In those less cynical days, U.S. commanders openly admitted their intention to turn resisting areas into a howling wilderness. The problem faced by the U.S. conquerors was well expressed by General Franklin Bell, who explained that practically the entire population has been hostile to us at heart. Thus, it was necessary to terrorize them into submission, keeping them in such a state of anxiety and apprehension that living under such conditions will soon become unbearable, and their burning desire for the war to cease will ultimately impel them to devote themselves in earnest to bringing about a real state of peace and to join hands with the Americans. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos were pacified permanently in this early exercise in winning hearts and minds. Filipino nationalists, incidentally, knew very well what was to come when they attempted to defend their newly won independence from U.S. forces dispatched on direct orders from the Almighty himself, as President McKinley explained, to secure the outpost for freedom in Asia. One wrote that the Filipinos have already accepted the arbitrariness of war, and war is the worst condition conceivable, especially when waged by an Anglo-Saxon race, which despises its opponent as an alien or inferior people. Yet the Filipinos accepted it with a full knowledge of its horror and of the sacrifices in life and property, which they knew they would be called upon to make. The period of explicit colonial rule, lasting from 1898 to 1946, with a brief World War II interregnum of Japanese occupation, was characterized by economic and political domination by U.S. administrators and a local and U.S.-based economic elite. The local elite was made up largely of major landholders, whose interests were cemented to those of the United States by the privileged U.S. market position of Philippine sugar, though there was also a business class, partly independent, but much of it servicing predominant U.S. economic interests. After the defeat of Japan in World War II, the Philippines were granted technical independence under the rule of a conservative oligarchy closely linked to the United States mafia butchers, with a pre-war colonial economy restored. The pre-1972 pre-martial law economy of the Philippines was one of extremely concentrated economic and political power, with a powerful landlord and business class, the famous 400 families, an enormous U.S. influence based on nearly $2 billion investment and a network of business, financial, and military linkages. The first president of the newly independent country, quote unquote, was Japanese collaborator Manuel Roxas, reinstated by General MacArthur under the pretext that he had been a double agent. The Philippine Communist Party, PKP, which had been in the forefront of the anti-Japanese guerrilla struggle, attempted to enter the Philippine political arena legally through a front political party, the Democratic Alliance, but failed as DA elected members of the Philippine Congress were denied their seats. The insurgency that followed was suppressed with extensive U.S. mafia thug support. The peasant rebellion had its roots in grievances and injustices and had become increasingly severe under U.S. colonial rule and was a direct consequence of the violence and lawlessness of the elites linked to the U.S. colonial system and the brutal post-war repression of the anti-Japanese resistance forces by the United States, which lent its support to the Japanese collaborators among the landholding classes and devoted itself to the destruction of the anti-Japanese resistance, very much as in Thailand, and for essentially the same reasons. Peasants turned to rebellion, stigmatized as, quote, communist terror, when very moderate demands were met with mounting force and violence by the United States and its local allies drawn from the wealthy elite. As Jonathan Fast observes, the Philippine counterinsurgency effort of the early 1950s served as a laboratory for later American involvement in Vietnam, where General Lansdale tried to repeat the Philippine success with Ngo Dinh Diem. From 1946 to 1972, the economy of the Philippines expanded rapidly within its neo-colonial and dependency framework. The salient features of this success are described by Van der Kroef: declining real wage rates, persistent extreme disparities in income levels, the seemingly unchecked power of private U.S. fraud white capitalists, especially in the context of the operation of a new Filipino family corporation, and, quote, graft and corruption prevalent everywhere, but particularly in government, whose machinery of justice was felt to benefit only the rich. The democratic facade of the Philippines was extremely brittle in this society, dominated by external interests and a tiny and very wealthy elite, including the U.S. favorite Ferdinand Marcos. A domestic crisis sharpened in the early 1970s, based fundamentally on the injustices of this exploitative, elite-dominated society, but precipitated by a rising tide of nationalism, fueled both by hostility to the Vietnam War and by resentment at continued U.S. economic domination and further penetration. The ruling of the Supreme Court of the Philippines in 1972 that the United States could no longer maintain its privileged position in land ownership and that U.S. citizens and corporations were subject to the general ban on foreign ownership on Philippine land brought the situation to a head. Marcos declared martial law in September 1972 and followed this with widespread arrests of opposition figures and intellectuals, tight control of the press, and new constitutional proposals considerably more favorable to American business interests than leftist and more radical nationalist sentiment in the Constitutional Convention would have wanted. Marcos seemed eager to stay on the right side of the U.S. Capitol. He also seemed intent on expanding opportunities for the domestic Philippine business. I'm going to read that sentence again. He also seemed intent on expanding opportunities for the domestic Philippine business of a few powerful families whose links with foreign interests and preponderant power in so many aspects of Philippine political life have been long viewed, particularly in PKP and NPA, New People's Army circles, as major obstacles to all significant reforms, and rightly so. When Marcos declared martial law in 1972, he announced a number of aims: reestablishing civil order, a crackdown on corruption, an intention to carry out major social reforms, and more muted and passed along more quietly to foreign governments and business interests, an intent to improve the investment climate for business. Only the conservative and business-oriented objectives have been seriously pursued. Although Marcos spoke of leading a revolution of the poor, this was cynical demagoguery. He has led a counter-revolution of a rich and expatriate elite. It was noted earlier that since 1972, corruption had not diminished in the least, but rather has shifted in composition to the looter class toward Marcos' family and friends. His land reform has been insignificant, enabling perhaps 40,000 out of several million tenant families to begin making payments for land purchases from their landlords. Wages have been controlled by martial law, abridgments of labor rights to organize and strike, and the operation of natural forces, quote unquote, under totalitarian free enterprise condition has exercised a further and familiar depressing influence on wages. In particular, the conversion of agricultural land to export and agribusiness has accelerated the displacement of rural labor and its flow into shantytown suburbs. Since Marcos assumed the presidency in 1965, the real wages of blue-collar and rural agricultural workers have fallen by one-third, and middle-class groups, such as civil servants, have also suffered major declines in real income. Social resources have gone heavily into beautifying Manila, while the countryside, where over 85% of the population live, has been committed to slumber in the 19th century. Weidman reports, he adds that to impress foreign visitors, the martial law government invested $608 million in 14 hotels and a convention center in Manila, all of them money losers, while over a quarter of the Manila population live in shanties, and life in the rural areas is even more bleak. The allocation of resources between the military establishment and urgent social needs, such as medical facilities, has also been typically sub-fascist. There has been a huge military buildup since 1972. The armed forces quadrupling in size to 225,000, and military outlays also increasing by more than fivefold, from 129 million in fiscal year 1973 to 676 million in fiscal year 1977. While military police expenditures soar, the Eastern Visayas, 85% of the population, cannot afford to even enter a hospital. According to public health officials, 37% of doctors and 46% of all Philippine nurses work in Manila. Weidman reports further that although pneumonia and tuberculosis are the two major killers in the Philippines, there are no programs for their eradication. And despite the scarcity of healthcare in the rural areas, Imelda Marcos, who was appointed Metro Manila governor by her husband, the president, spent $50 million on Palacio Manila Heart Sanatorium, which is largely unused. The human rights U.S. aid pattern is also familiar. Over 60,000 persons had been arrested under martial law by 1977, with the numbers detained at any one time necessarily obscure but running into the thousands. As late as December 1975, Marcos asserted that no one had been tortured. But in fact, torture has been widespread and systematic. According to Amnesty International, and 88 individual torturers were identified by name by AI in 1976. The forms employed are the ones that have now been standardized throughout the American mafia empire, fantastically cruel and sadistic, and highly reminiscent of those we associate with Nazism. Prolonged beatings with fists, kicks, and karate blows, beatings with a variety of contusive instruments, including rifle butts, heavy wooden clubs, and family-sized soft drink bottles, the pounding of heads against walls or furniture, against the edge of a filing cabinet, the burning of genitals and pubic hair with the flame of a cigarette lighter, phalanga beating on the soles of the feet, and the so-called, quote, lying on air torture, in which an individual is made to lie with his feet on one bed, his head on a second bed, with a body lying on air in between. The individual is then beaten or kicked whenever he lets his body fall or sag. A particularly insidious form of interrogation, torture which emerges from the interviews, is the use of safe houses, as they are called. They are, in fact, torture centers which are used by the National Intelligence Service Agency, or NISA. The following description will give some idea of what has happened to martial law detainees taken to, quote-unquote, safe houses. He was beaten with a wooden club with four flat surfaces and an inscription on it. The torturers concentrated on his thighs, lower legs, and buttocks, but also struck his head, face, chest, stomach, and back with the club. He vomited often during and after the beatings. His entire body grew swollen, with areas of skin were stripped from his thighs. The scars continued to be painful when touched. The AI delegates found there were still two deep scars on his legs a year and a half later, which were not completely healed. There were three scars on his legs from cigarette burns. It should be noted that NICE is an intelligence agency answerable only to President Marcos under the command of the president's personal head of security, General Fabian Burr. There are other disturbing patterns of torture which emerged from the interviews. For example, a large number of the detainees who were interrogated by the Metropolitan Command of the Philippine Constabulary were subjected to torture by electric shock. Two sisters in their early 20s who were recently released without having been charged or tried after 2 years of detention told us that they were subjected to approximately 45 minutes of electroshock each, one sister being forced to watch the other. They described the ordeal as follows. You can't help screaming. It makes you writhe all over. We had hallucinations afterwards. We each lost 5 pounds from the torture sessions. We couldn't walk straight. We had burns on our hands. They didn't allow us to sleep for almost 2 nights running. We were threatened with rape from the very beginning. Mrs. Trinidad Herrera, a well-known community leader of Tondo, a huge squatter suburb of Manila, who has fought for the interests of the poor in opposition to beautification progress of Mrs. Marcos, which would have demolished several urban poor communities, was arrested by the regime and subjected to beatings and extensive electric shock tortures, including application to the extremities and nipples in a quote-unquote safe house. Upon release, she was in a state of shock and unable to speak for 5 days. She was released in part because of a strenuous protest by the U.S. mafia state, which was responding to indignant outcries within both the Philippines and abroad, which all goes to show that in a system of sponsored torture by the United States mafia thugs, the sponsor can occasionally demonstrate its essential humanity by such acts of grace. The Herrera controversy was so intense that her torturers were actually brought to trial and acquitted, and their work continues unhindered except for momentary pauses on 2 occasions. When the aid to Marcos is under consideration by the U.S. Congress, and when dignitaries of the U.S., such as Vice President Walter Mondale, stop to visit on the journeys throughout the sub-fascist provinces. For these occasions, Marcos has mastered the art of making the verbal and tokenistic gestures necessary to placate an indulgent parent like Jimmy Carter, a parent easily reassured on such secondary issues as a total suppression of democratic rights and systematic torture. He may announce a release of political prisoners, although none were admitted to exist previously, or he may proclaim and possibly even hold demonstrations, elections, or he may issue bravado on interference and the need to renegotiate the terms of the agreement on U.S. bases in the Philippines. Marcos has little to worry about, however, as he knows from long experience. If he were to do something serious, such as expropriating U.S.-owned pineapple plantations, we would witness a less complacent U.S. response, less defensiveness with regard to Marcos, a reduced willingness to be taken in by gestures, and a deeper regard for human rights, not to speak of more forceful measures. The Marcos regime has been sufficiently disturbed by international publicity and congressional reaction to its political prisoners and use of torture that it has moved to a more advanced sub-fascist process, namely the use of unexplained quote-unquote disappearances and the police burial of dissidents allegedly killed in firefights, quote-unquote, with the police and army. By these improvements, dissidents are killed and evidence of their torture is eliminated. Thus, by simple deployment of repression techniques used in other parts of the American mafia colonial empire, dissidents can be dealt with more efficiently, and the State Department can assert that torture, quote, is on the decline. On the essentials, that is creating a hospitable investment climate, and in the Philippine case, allowing U.S. occupation of major military base sites, Marcos has been entirely satisfactory, which is the main reason why his human rights violations will never be compellingly important. And while Jimmy Carter and U.S. leaders will be impressed with quote-unquote improvements and Marcos' assurances that a better day lies immediately ahead. We saw earlier that Marcos quickly suspended the Supreme Court ruling against the U.S. land ownership and accommodated immediately to the primary condition for sub-fascist rule, namely solidifying the external constituency by assuring U.S. business interests that their bidding will be done. Business Week noted that Marcos has made it abundantly clear that he wants to help American business as much as domestic politics will allow. All Marcos asks is a percentage of the U.S. capitalist white fraud take, which is standard practice in the mafia American thug empire. And as with the suspension of democracy and systematic torture, this has been quite acceptable. In fact, as we discussed earlier, repression and torture have been integral to the economic policies of sub-fascism as achieving passivity, order, and stability. In nationalistic third world states, allowing multinationals to dominate the economy, to buy out or destroy domestic enterprises, to dispossess large numbers of peasants in a rapid development of export-oriented agriculture, and to implement the deflationary unemployment generating policies required by the international banking fraternity. All these are not easily achieved within a democratic order. The collective conspiracy of a comprador business elite, local military elite officers, and foreign capitalist white fraud economic and military interests normally cannot maintain quote-unquote stability without active or threatened terror. An officer of manufacturers, Hanover Trust Bank, speaking of the Philippines, noted in 1976 that, quote, in recent years, major social and political reforms have reduced the bottlenecks that hampered past efforts to achieve faster economic growth. Since the only social and political reforms in recent years have been the implementation of the Marcos dictatorship and martial law regime, we have an explicit translation of multinational business values into the concept of quote-unquote reform and desirable social and political structures for the third world. It may throw some light on why quote-unquote human rights crusade under Jimmy Carter remains a dead letter within the U.S. mafia regimes. In the case of the Philippines, the two huge U.S. military installations of Subic Bay and Clark Air Force Base are also a factor influencing U.S. official reaction to human rights violations. The Pentagon wants these bases, and President Carter has been too weak to suffer the loss of face involved in abandoning them, although they have lost most of their value, even for a quote-unquote forward strategy. And Marcos uses them as an instrument of blackmail and to tie the United States more closely to his totalitarian dictatorship regime. By holding up the United States for even greater ransom for their use, Marcos extracts more loot from the U.S. taxpayer, about $200 million a year, but also very cleverly conveys the impression of quote-unquote independence and of his willingness to stand up for his indulgent parent. Marcos has provided the requisite terror and quote-unquote stability in the Philippines, and accordingly, he has been generously supported by the United States and its affiliated lending white capitalist fraud mafia enterprise. As human rights violations become truly massive under martial law, military aid from the U.S. doubled. U.S. business banks and the IMF and World Bank have been greatly encouraged by Marcos' new order, and capitalists poured in foreign investment more than doubled on an annual average basis after 1972. And the external debt of the Philippines rose from $2.2 billion to $6 billion in 1977. The Philippines has become one of the largest borrowers of the international lending institution, its loans having grown from $183 million in 1972 to $1.5 billion in 1976. The sharp increase in U.S. military and non-military aid is thus once more correlated with a major rise in violations of human rights, degradation of the economic and social condition of the majority of the population, and an improved investment climate. The dominant elites Sub-fascism are fortunate also that the U.S. provides the best that money can buy in repression expertise, torture technology to help keep their population under control. Even before the Constitutional Convention was aborted by the Marcos coup in 1972, charges have been made that U.S. aid and the CIA were training Philippine police under the public safety program, quote, for eventual paramilitary and counterinsurgency operation as part of the global program designed to militarize and mercenize the police forces and its client states. Between 1948 and 1968, more than $1.7 billion has been provided in U.S. economic and military grants and loans under the U.S. Military Assistance Program, including more than $400 million in hardware. Under the rubric of technical assistance, U.S. aid financed the Office of Public Safety, which was extensively involved in reorganizing funding and training the Philippine police apparatus, both in the Philippines and the U.S. from 1965 to September 21st, 1972, the day martial law was declared. In December 1966, Frank Walton, fresh from service in Saigon, where, quote, he oversaw the growth and large-scale reorganization of the South Vietnamese police force, all part of the overall CIA plan to dissolve the political infrastructure of the NLF, was installed as team chief for aid OPS. He was assisted by a variety of U.S. officials with experience in Brazil, the Philippines, Ethiopia, and elsewhere, as well as by Philippine intelligence officers who have been trained by the CIA during the U.S.-backed suppression of the Huck insurgency and had become resident experts on counterintelligence operations in and around Saigon. Walton's group submitted a report to U.S. aid in February 1967, which served as the impetus for a drastic reorganization of the Philippine apparatus and for a much enlarged and more involved U.S. public safety division. For fiscal year 1972 to 1973, the expanded public safety program was budgeted by the U.S. government at $3.9 million, a marked increase. Police are trained in the United States at CIA, FBI, Army, and local police training centers, and in the Philippines at training academies, which were easily converted into detention camps to hold the large numbers of political prisoners after martial law was declared. With increased U.S. involvement in internal security problems, the new program was patterned on the CORD, Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support Program, the pacification program in Vietnam. The new Philippine project was initially staffed by former CORDS officials from Vietnam, headed by Thomas Rose, who was aide public administration chief in Saigon, and Richard Kreigel, former CORDS provincial advisor in Binh province. U.S. military units have been involved in civic operations in conjunction with the Filipino Army that clearly had relevance to internal security problems. On July 12, 1973, William Sullivan was confirmed by the Senate for the post of ambassador to the Philippines. Sullivan had been U.S. ambassador to Laos from 1964 to 1969, whereas Anthony Lewis remarked, he played a decisive part in what must qualify as the most appalling episode of lawless cruelty in American history, the bombing of Laos, the episode which, incidentally, was initially suppressed by the New York Times editors. Sullivan has had a major role in organizing and coordinating U.S. subversive and military mafia activities in Southeast Asia. And though his contribution to the people of Laos pale before those of his murderous successor, G. Murtis Godley, who implemented the Nixon-Kissinger program, they nevertheless achieved considerable scale. It is altogether appropriate that Sullivan should have been shifted to the Philippines, just as Lansdale moved from the Philippines to Vietnam 20 years earlier as part of the continuing effort to assist the people of Southeast Asia to remain in the free world. The logical next step was to dispatch Sullivan to Iran, where he could convey Jimmy Carter's message of support to the Shah as his U.S. armed troops, machine gun demonstrators in the streets, another application of the famed human rights, quote unquote, Carter policy. The resistance of Marcos' police state has grown slowly but persistently under the pressure of systematic abuse of the majority of the population, and there is good reason to suppose that the U.S. supplied weapons, counterinsurgency training, and possibly even direct intervention will be needed sometime in the future to shore up a system that violates every principle of humanity. The Muslim Bangsa Moro army, which began large-scale fighting against the regular army in 1972, has been the most pressing internal threat to Marcos' rule. Its 20,000-person army is still resisting effectively after years of bloody encounters, over 5,000 government casualties, 60,000 civilians killed, 1 million refugees from Marcos search and destroyed. The struggle was based on gradual accumulation of grievances by the Muslim population of the island of Mindanao, especially the continuous territorial encroachment by settlers, loggers, and agribusiness corporations, aided by Philippine army pacification operations. And a revolt was brewing on the Mindanao in the 1960s, and it turned into a national rebellion in the early 1970s. Throughout the entire Philippines, there is growing National Democratic Front, began in 1973 as a loosely armed coalition, as many struggling resistance groups covering many classes, organization, and strategies, united by a desire to end the U.S. Marcos dictatorship. It includes a new people's army, small but active on many islands, educating and encouraging passive and active guerrilla resistance and warfare in the countryside. The NPA is working a fertile field, since a substantial majority of the population is both rural and severely abused by Marcos' policies. The NDF also includes many members of the urban working class and subproletariat, banned from organizing and striking under Marcos regulations, but increasingly organizing and striking outside the law. Large numbers of students, other members of the intelligentsia, and great many religious workers were also properly included with the NDF. Marcos' U.S. forces and threats of force have so far done their job in limiting the effectiveness of the NDF and keeping the vast majority passive. But the latent hostility to the dictatorship bursts into the open when little crevices of opportunity arises and suggests that the present regime may be sitting on a powder leg. All of this is reminiscent of the earlier peasant rebellion of 1954 to 1956. There are still those who see U.S. actions in Vietnam as an aberration, a deviation from the disinterested concern and noble efforts that animate U.S. policy in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. This view of essential benevolence, in fact, has dominated scholarship, journalism, and school texts, with the aberration concept a necessary complement, providing an explanation for any ongoing exception. For many years, the Philippines has stood as a neglected monument, contradicting this conception of the fundamentals of U.S. foreign policy, from the brutal exercise in pacification at the turn of the century to the early post-World War II repression, as the groundwork is being laid in neo-colonial economic and social conditions by the white mafia gangsters, aided by U.S. finance and sponsor pacification techniques and policies. No one should be surprised if a renewed constructive bloodbath begins to unfold in that country. This is a system of injustice that daily sows the seed of its own destruction. It may meet a banker's standards of worth, but it fails to meet any human criteria, as evidenced by its open reliance on violence and the denial of human rights to the vast bulk of the Southeast Asian population. As in many parts of the empire, formerly conservative churches have been forced into open opposition by the sheer inhumanity of sub-fascist practice and the stripping away of other protective resources from a defenseless population. It is a remarkable and central fact of modern history that the United States has sponsored and continues to support the sub-fascist mafia state, its police, military arms, its torture, and its savagely exploitative economic policies, and has called forth in country after country a church response as the last refuge of abused majorities. So that's the Philippines. I'm going to make just a couple comments. So you can see it's the standard story. The standard thing with the U.S. government in the Philippines was, the military elite, a small military group of generals and elite run by, an authoritarian dictator basically police torture the people, develop a fascist police state, repress the people, keep them in a state of slavery, a state of murder, a state of torture, and then, just keep the money flowing into the white fraud capitalists and have the U.S. mass media work the system and make sure the U.S. government looks like, good people. This is a total mafia enterprise, a group of mafia, racist white thugs. The Dominican Republic, U.S. model for third world development. In his Stages of Economic Growth, Walt W. Rostow describes the development process for third world countries that come into our orbit. They become gradually like us with advanced industrial technologies and democratic institutions. The Dominican Republic offers an earthly illustration of the reality of development process under U.S. auspices. It is an especially apt and relevant case for this reason. With and after the invasion of 1965, the U.S. reasserted effective control over that small country and has thoroughly dominated its politics and economics. Given the absence of any threatening counterforces, we can say that in the Dominican Republic, the flow of events surely must have been in conformity with the desires of the U.S. foreign policy leadership. It will be recalled that the U.S. invaded the Dominican Republic in 1965 to prevent the displacement of the relatively benign fascist regime of Donald Reed Cabral by the constitutional regime of Juan Bosch, who had been overthrown by a military coup in 1963 without eliciting any U.S. intervention to save him and his brief experiment in democratic government. The rationalization by the racist mafia gangster Lyndon Johnson and his spokesman alleging an imminent threat of communism were convincingly shown by an imminent threat of communism, which were convincingly shown by Theodore Draper and others to have been a hypocritical cover for a positive preference for fascism over a less reliable and less controllable democratic reformist government. The invasion of 1965 established a firm U.S. grip on the island. As Bosch put it in June 1975, this country is not pro-American. It is United States property. What then have been the main characteristics of the Dominican model of third world development as seen in a country under close U.S. surveillance and control, ? The first characteristic has been extensive and systematic terror. In the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Brazil, three client fascist systems that came into being with explicit U.S. connivance by a strange coincidence, paramilitary death squads, quote unquote, quickly made their appearance and went on a rampage against political dissenters, petty criminals, and sometimes purely arbitrary victims. Amnesty International called special attention to the numerous political assassinations carried out by death squads, such as notorious La Banda, that have openly tolerated and supported by the national police. In 1970, it was alleged that there was one death or disappearance every 34 hours. In July 1971, Norman Gall alleged that in the post-1965 era, the number of political murders in the Dominican Republic exceeded that of any comparable period under the monstrous Trujillo. Gall noted that the Santo Domingo newspaper El Nacional last December 30 filed a page and a half of newsprint with the details of 186 political murders and 30 enforced disappearances during 1970. The Dominican terror resembles the current wave of political killings in Guatemala, in that the paramilitary death squads are organized by the armed forces and the police, which in both cases over the years have been given heavy U.S. material and advisory support for the killings. Gall went on to note that the essential function of political terror in the Dominican Republic has been to control the slum population, which was the main force that defeated the Dominican military in the 1965 revolution. The Wall Street Journal reported on September 9, 1971, that the conservative Catholic Church hierarchy has condemned the institutionalization of terror. The journal also claimed that the opinion was widespread in the Dominican Republic that the United States mafia thugs was behind the paramilitary death squads. Whether or not this specific allegation was true, the journal observed that the embassy has done nothing publicly to dissociate itself from the terror. The U.S. continues to provide substantial aid, training, equipment, and arms to the Dominican police and army. Since 1971, the rate of killing has slackened, but political assassinations continue, and the incarceration and torture of political prisoners still plays a key role in maintaining stability. Amnesty International recently stated that, quote, precise, detailed, and consistent information indicates that practices amounting to serious violations of human rights are still going on. The arbitrary arrest, kidnapping, and assassination of the regime's political opponents, the removal of certain political prisoners to isolation in provincial jails and military forts, deplorable prison conditions, ill treatment, and police brutally inflicted on many detainees, and the continued detention of prisoners once their sentences expire. The U.S. State Department, on the other hand, in its 1978 Human Rights Report to Congress, finds a substantial reduction in incidents of military and police repression, a working constitutional democracy, and over a dozen political parties officially recognized and freely active throughout the 1974 elections were marred by some incidents of military intervention on behalf of the president's re-election. On this last point, the Washington Office of Latin America notes that the State Department demolishes its own argument. The official recognition means little, and political parties are not really free if the military acts against them during an election. Harassment of opposition forces has not ceased, despite Balaguer's claim to have ordered the military to remain neutral. In the fall of 1977, a pre-election campaign for 1978 was beginning. At local headquarters of the Social Democratic Opposition Party, PRD, was burned to the ground, and a PRD official, Samuel Sintan Melo, was murdered. Subsequently, of course, the military intervened more comprehensively to avert Balaguer's defeat in May 1978, seizing the ballot boxes and arresting and driving underground many leaders of the PRD, before pressure from both the Dominican elite and the Carter administration eventually forced the military and Balaguer to allow a transfer of presidency to Guzman, a wealthy landholder himself. Guzman would not have been running at all and would not have been much allowed to take office if he had posed a threat to serious reform. The military and its external sponsor, Jimmy Carter, assure that the new PRD operates within a very narrow boundary of policy actions. All the more reason then for the State Department to be pleased with the progress of the Dominican Republic, to be assured by the promises of its leaders, and to find that this client fascist state deserves the funds still allocated to it for military assistance. A second characteristic of the Dominican Republic model is widespread venality. Alan Riding wrote in 1975 that the blatant corruption of military and civilian sectors of the government is spreading bitterness among the urban masses whose wages have been held down despite high inflation rates since 1960. The military and police in this client state are numerous and well taken care of. According to Riding, one method whereby Balaguer retained control was by openly allowing senior officials to enrich themselves. With officer salaries of $700 a month, for example, most of the country's 37 generals live in huge modern houses, drive limousines, and own cattle ranches. More recently, John Nordheimer wrote that corruption among generals is almost as legendary as their ineptitude. In the first place, there are about twice as many generals, around 40, as there should be for the size of the military forces. Generals are promoted on the basis of family, friendship, and business connections. It is common knowledge that Lieutenant General Juan Beauchamp Javier, Secretary of State for the Armed Forces, owns a $300,000 yacht in partnership with a Dominican businessman, and that Major General Navar Siejas, the commander of the National Peace, in part owner of a major Santo Domingo hotel and a gambling casino. A recent report to the Securities and Exchange Commission by Philip Morris showed one, a $16,000 payment to a Dominican tax official was for a favorable tax ruling. Two, the payment of $120,000 to various Dominican legislators for the passage of a law that would give Philip Morris a privileged position in the Virginia tobacco line. And three, monthly payments of $1,000 by Philip Morris to Juan Balaguer himself, the president of a presumably independent state, taking payouts from a private American business firm would seem rather sensational, but this passed off virtually unnoticed in the United States Gulf and Western. In the United States, Gulf and Western made $146,000 in, quote, questionable payments through foreign subsidiaries in 1976. And although the distribution of those payments was not revealed by the SEC, the usefulness of such a lubricant in the Dominican Republic and G&W's large place there rouses plausible suspicions. U.S. firms get businesses done in the Dominican Republic. U.S. firms get business done in the Dominican Republic not only by payoffs, but by putting important people on their payrolls and by building both personal and financial ties to the local elite. Thus, in the mid-1970s, the brother of the important director of tourism was vice president of G&W's sugar-producing subsidiary in the Dominican Republic. G&W is also reported to have established cordial relations with General the Police Tadeo Guerrera, who was active in the destruction of the last strong independent union in the sugar business. Gulf and Western is the largest private landowner and employer in the country, with some 8% of all arable lands, mainly in sugar, owner of a large resort complex, and with investments in some 90 Dominican businesses. G&W's annual sales are larger than the GNP of the Dominican Republic, and while it does not by itself control the country in size, internal connections and the background support of the external sponsor of Dominican sub-fascism give the company a great deal of leverage and might even justify the designation of the Dominican Republic as a, quote, company country. Its rapid expansion within the Dominican Republic since 1967 has been a result in part of the great profitability of its sugar operations and an 18% ceiling on profit repatriation. A potential competitor to Gulf and Western's large seaside resort at La Ramona, M. Wayne Miller, ran into a steady series of obstacles in the early 1970s from the tourism office in importing supplies and obtaining tax concessions supposedly available to foreign enterprises. In April 1975, a government decree was signed expropriating Fuller's beachland property for use as a public park, as helped along possibly by the fact that the president of another G&W subsidiary was an advisor to the Dominican Republic Park Commission. This decree was rescinded when Fuller mobilized his forces, including various army officers and Balaguer himself. In brief, foreign interests are exceedingly powerful as they curry and buy favor and mobilize their elite cadres, with whom they jointly dominate and loot this small dependency. A third characteristic of the Dominican model has been a radical sweetening of conditions for foreign business and a strong reliance on foreign investment for national development. As in Greece under the Kernels regime of 1967 and 1973, great stress has been placed on tourism and investments related to tourism, resort hotels, airport development. An investment incentives law of 1968 removed any restrictions on foreign ownership and extended generous and tax and duty exemptions to new investments and guaranteed capital and profit repatriation. U.S. companies have swarmed into Dominican agriculture, food processing, mining, banking, hotel and resort complexes. In 1969, G&W became manager of the large tax-free zone adjacent to G&W's Cajules Golf Course, one of the main Dominican Republic ads in the New York Times, funded in good part by quote-unquote contributions from foreign companies in the country, notes that companies settling within the G&W free zone are given special duty-free import and export privileges. They are granted a 10-year tax-free status. The reporter Michael Flannery describes G&W free zone in the following language. Shotgun-toting custom agents and national police man checkpoints at entrances to the free zone, which is surrounded by a high chain link fence topped with multiple strands of barbed wire. CNTD, National Confederation of Dominican Workers, and visiting officials of the AFL-CIO charged that the zone had the air of a modern slave labor camp. That they said the carefully controlled access was designed not only to prevent smuggling, but to thwart efforts to organize the workers into unions that would force an improvement in conditions. A fourth characteristic of the Dominican Republic model, related to the preceding, is an effective government pacification of the labor force, a crucial requirement for the appropriate climate of investment. As noted above, the systematic police terror since 1965 and the Johnson mafia butcher has returned to large urban proletariat and subproletariat to the desired state of passivity, and the countryside has been more easily kept in line by periodic violence and threats. The Dominican Republic advertisement section in the New York Times of January 28, 1973 has a heading titled Industrial Dream of Chances Like These, featuring a low wage rates running between 25 and 50 cents an hour. The ad stresses the role of the law in fixing hours and wages and allowing the free import of foreign technicians. There is no mention of any trade unions, but employers will probably read between the lines that unions have been broken and pacified with the assistance of George Meany and the AFL-CIO. Of special interest is the regular use of government troops and police to break up independent unions. The agricultural union Sindicato Unido, which operated the fields now owned by G&W, was broken by police action in 1966 and 1967, and a number of its leaders, including the union lawyer Guido Gill, were arrested and killed by forces of law and order. Another major foreign enterprise, Falcon Bridge Nickel, also successfully broke a union with army and police assistance in 1970. A Wall Street Journal report of September 1971 states that, quote, when a union attempted to organize construction workers at a foreign-owned ferronickel mill project last year, Anne Belager sent in the army to help straighten things out. While the soldiers kept order, the contractors fired 32 allegedly leftist leaders. The strike was broken in 8 days. Matters had not changed much in the mid-1970s. An ad hoc human rights group that visited the Dominican Republic in 1975 reported that working people have prevented by nearly every conceivable means from forming and joining a trade union organization. A union organizing effort in the G&W Free Trade Zone in the mid-1970s was broken with the help of the police in arresting, jailing, and deporting labor organizers, and with the use of, quote, troops in full combat, armed with submachine guns to break up and organizing meetings. I'm going to read that sentence one more time. A union organizing effort in the G&W Free Trade Zone in the mid-1970s was broken with the help of police in arresting, jailing, and deporting labor organizers with the use of troops in full combat gear armed with submachine guns to break up organizing meetings. Flannery states, officials of the Dominican Labor Ministry told organizers that contrary to the paper guarantees of the Republic laws, workers would not be allowed to form the union in the industrial free zone. On the right matter of labor unions, the 1977 Carter Mafia State Department Human Rights Report has the following information. Labor unions are permitted to function, and numerous labor unions exist, including some associated with opposition parties, but under some government controls. That exhausts the topic. In containing unions and rendering them docile to the Dominican elite has had the steadfast support of the top echelons of the AFL-CIO, which has long cooperated closely with the CIA and international business firms in this unsavory operation. Its arm Contral actually helped destroy the pro-labor Bosch regime in 1963 and has steadily supported its totalitarian and anti-labor successors. Presumably, their blind hatred of communism and radicalism in general has led Meany and his co-followers and his close followers to sell out systematically the interests of labor in the Dominican Republic and in other U.S. satellites. Meany and other labor bosses actually have a more direct interest in the pacification of labor in the Dominican Republic. Meany, his number two man, Lane Kirkland, Alexander Barkin, director of COPE, the AFL-CIO political arm, and Edward Carlo, president of the Sheet Metal Workers, are all stockholders in the 15,000-acre Punta Cana resort and plantation in the Dominican Republic. In order to clear the ground for this enterprise designed for a beautiful people, a large number of squatters were evicted by the army. A fifth characteristic of the Dominican model, following naturally from the preceding, is the sharp deterioration in the well-being of the bulk of the population. In serving the interests of a traditional and expatriate elite, the Dominican Republic has been turned into a tourist and industrial paradise with a 25-cent minimum wage and hardworking, peaceful labor, quote unquote. Translated, no threat of strikes from any independent unions, and with 4 tax-free zones filled with manufacturers of brushes, brasseries, batteries, electronic devices, wigs, undergarments, components, and consumer goods. The effect of the 1965 counter-revolution and the installation of the Dominican Republic model on income distribution and welfare were summarized by the Wall Street Journal of September 9, 1971 as follows. The middle and upper classes are better off, as are the lower classes lucky enough to have jobs. But work is scarce, the poor are poorer and more numerous. Per se, capital income is about the same as before 1965, but it's less equitably distributed. A foreign economic expert says he estimates the per capita income at $240, 3 times that of Haiti, but half that of Cuba. Most of the 370 women who work at La Ramona earned 30 to 40 cents per hour last year. Malnutrition is widespread. Says George B. Mathis, director of care in the Dominican Republic, you see kids with swollen bellies all over the country, even here in Santo Domingo, from starvation. Food production is hampered by semi-feudal land tenure. At last count, less than 1% of the farmers own 47.5% of the land, while 82% farm fewer than 10 acres. Land reform has moved with glacial speed. Most Dominican children don't go beyond the 3rd grade. Only 1 in 5 reaches the 6th grade. G&W acknowledged in 1978 that cane cutter monkey wages had not kept up with inflation in the year since 1966, and there is other evidence to the same effect, which suggests a probable further absolute fall in the real income of the majority and a further shift toward inequality in income shares. There is also evidence that the nutritional deficit of the Dominican majority is huge. Michael Flannery cites a report which states that in 1972, a mere 11% of the Dominicans drink milk, 4% eat meat, and 2% eat eggs. Fish are plentiful in the waters off the island, but draw better prices in other markets. So few Dominicans include fish in their protein-poor diet. In the Dominican Republic, we see the working out, once again, of the familiar repression, exploitation, trickle-down model of the American mafia thug economic growth program. The export-oriented agriculture is, as is common throughout the empire, displacing an already underemployed peasantry and rural workforce, increasing the mass of dispossessed and malnourished. The unemployment rate has been extraordinarily high, on the order of 30 to 40%. The mass of the population has been entirely excluded from any opportunity for economic advancement, education, or political participation. The large majority, as in Brazil, Indonesia, or the Philippines, is a cost to be minimized and a threat to be contained. The process of development observed here is acceptable on the assumption implicit throughout the American mafia empire that the only welfare of the local and expatriate elites need be taken into account. The decline in the welfare of the majority, their exclusion from any power whatsoever, and the cultural degradation of the Dominican Republic are obviously besides the point. Stability, quote unquote, has been brought to the country, and from the perspective of U.S. investment opportunities, the Dominican Republic deserves the growing description of a U.S. Embassy report describing it as a, quote unquote, little Brazil and one of the brightest spots in Latin America. So, I'm just going to, make a couple comments. So basically, the Dominica is just the same kind of program as, all of this other we discussed today, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia. It is a military state of racist mafia, murderous white thugs. They basically subjugated the Dominican people into slave conditions. They earn 30, 40 cents an hour. They're, basically abused and beaten by the police. And there is absolutely no medical care. They're all starving to death. And it's, the capitalist white frauds of the United States government, as well as its white racist, fraud media that, keeps the lies going that Dominica is a great place and a great haven for investors and a great human rights program. And, with the Carter administration, Johnson administration, Ford and Nixon administrations, this has become, another American failure at capitalism and a racist group of American mafia murderous thugs. Finishing up, we're going to do Latin America proliferating sub-fascism, and then we're going to stop. Friends and fellow Christians, it is time that you realize that our continent is becoming one gigantic prison, and in some regimes, one vast cemetery. We, with the exception of Cuba, are trapped in the same system. We all move within one economic, political, military complex in which one finds committed the fabulous interests of the financial white elite groups that dominate the life of your country and the Creole oligarchies of our Latin American nations. Both groups, more allied today than ever, have held back time after time the great transformation that our people need and desperately demand, a Latin American church group reports. Quote, the dominant presence of this inevitable parameter, national security, imposes the tremendous burden of an economy which is viscerally destructive to the normal expectations of development and welfare, which move all the peoples. Hence, a new dilemma, welfare security, previously pointed out by Goring in less just but highly suggestive terms, more guns and less butter. In fact, there is no getting around the necessity of sacrificing welfare to the benefits of the security when the latter is actually endangered. Those people who refuse to admit this have learned in the dust of defeat a well-deserved lesson, a Brazilian general reports. And starting tomorrow, we'll do a Nazi parallel, the national security state and the churches. That is pretty much all of Latin America is going to be covered to the end. It's about 40 pages or so. And then once we're done with that, we'll go on to bloodbaths in Indochina, constructive, nefarious, and cynical. So tomorrow is basically Latin America and Central America. So basically, in summary, we're just going to, finish up. We made all our comments, so we're going to finish up with our, closing remarks. So again, I have the Google Drive link on the description section. Please access it, download the book as you need, and read the book. I think it's an excellent resources to have. Washington Connection and Third World Fascism, the Political Economy of Human Rights, Volume 1, Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman. And so we're going to get started. It is clear that President Sukarno in Indonesia was ousted by the United States' angry white vigilante butchers of Washington during the 1965 September 30th movement, in which a kidnapping of several army generals led by Colonel Untung was initiated by conversations between the CIA, United States Congress, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Lyndon Johnson, State Department, and American nexus of academic white frauds of the University of California Berkeley, later named the Berkeley Mafia, President Suharto, and Russel, Fiefield of University of Michigan, Harvard and Yale University, Lucian Pye of MIT, and several other academic professors of universities in the United States and various American white fraud capitalists, including Guy Pauker of Rand Corporation, Ford Foundation, and the military general elite of Indonesia. We previously reviewed the book 10 Years of Military Terror in Indonesia. The website, the link for the podcast is on my playlist. If you wish to access it, it is another book. We describe the international context in which the Indonesia was released from Dutch colonial rule in 1949. After being released, the popular and democratically elected leader, Koesne Sukarno, immediately rose to power. He stayed in power throughout the 1950s and until 1965. He was a revered Indonesian patriot, nationalist, against the Washington colonial mafia, thugs, and racist oppression, and very interested in Indonesian sovereignty and prosperity. He fought for oil nationalization as well as nationalization of all Indonesian natural resources, including oil reserves, timber, copra, coffee, tea, coffee, tobacco, palm oil, palm kernels, pepper, and hard fibers, as well as natural gas, which Indonesia had in abundant supply. This nationalist ideology conflicted greatly with the angry white vigilante butchers of Washington. The United States government used every opportunity to undercut Sukarno's democratic and populist support, including illegal actions, direct military confrontation with the threat of naval blockade and attack, continued secretive communication with the treasonous generals of the Indonesian army, and CIA covert action with various personnel of the U.S. government in Indonesia. It is clear that the oil reserves of Indonesia was a large reason for U.S. government genocidal mafia thug campaign against the Indonesian people, as President Sukarno was interested in nationalizing the oil industry and also nationalizing the resources of the land. This, of course, is the birthright of the Indonesian people that was ripped away by the colonial butchers of the United States. Dr. Chomsky also discussed Thailand and the Philippines, Thailand being a corrupt firm base with the white mafia American racist gangsters supplying military weapons to the military dictatorship that keeps the people in position of slavery and economic misery. This small Thai elite keep the money in their hands and become the agents of the Washington's butcher campaign in Southeast Asia. This is exemplified by the Thai ruthless dictator Tanam Kachakorn, who subjugated the people to severe repression and murder through the white mafia American thugs. Finally, we discussed the Philippines, where Ferdinand Marcos, the ruler of the Philippines, was a military dictator that created hell on earth for his people, using Washington guns and genocidal hardware, and enslaving the Filipino masses while his elite enjoyed luxury lifestyle and freedom to choose who to machine gun down in the Philippine public. So in summary, the U.S. is a group of mafia white gangsters of mass murder, slavery, racist third world exploitation, and torture. And so that's it. 2 hours, 24 minutes. I'll be back tomorrow with the second part of this chapter, Constructive Terror. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.